All right, welcome back to The Journey for another month, and this time around speaking to a lovely lady by the name of Joan Parker. Good morning, Joan.
Good morning, Kevin.
Thank you so much for being part of this, because it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm led to believe you're the one responsible for there being a submarine parked in the centre of Holbrook in our region, or some degree, but we can talk some more about that a little later on. But am I correct? Is that...
Well, more or less, but I would hardly say I was responsible, but certainly I was involved.
That's good to hear. So that story is still to come. But we always start the journey with, because it is a story, a series that's been running for multiple years now around just celebrating the Albury-Wodonga region and the people around that make us what we are and what makes those people tick. So we always start with the local tie to the area. How did you come about to be here? Were you born here, schooled here? What happened?
Well, I suppose you could say I'm a Murray River person because I spent the early part of my life from 3 years till 14 at Echuca, literally living on the banks of the Murray River. There our home was just across the road, and so we lived in the water in the summer. My father accepted a call. He was the Presbyterian minister here at St David's in 1956, and we moved to Albury. I went to Woodstock Presbyterian Girls' School. My parents were very proud to be able to send me to a private school for a couple of years, and finished my secondary education there and went nursing at the Albury Base Hospital. I did my 4-year training as an RN at the Albury Base, and from there met my husband and got married and went to Holbrook. So that's my association with the area, and I lived in Holbrook for 55 years before coming back here.
That's fantastic. Now, so let's talk about Holbrook. At the moment, part of Greater Hume Shire, and there's been boundary changes and amalgamations and all sorts of things over the years, but you were a mayor at one point in time, is that right?
Yeah, you're right about that. Completely unplanned. Yes, it happened in the middle. Like a lot of ladies of my vintage, children flown the coop and wondering what will I do with my life. And I'd always lived on the farm, loved living on the farm, but was not what you'd call a farmer's wife. I bogged tractors and did disastrous things, so I stopped being asked to help. I was scared of cattle. So yeah, I was the community lady. I was the PNC, the Mothers Club and the tennis club and the what have you, and always been a secretary or a president or a treasurer, or certainly on the committee. I played sport. I was always interested in what the kids did, and that's where my interests lay. So here the kids had flown the coop, and I was left, what'll I do? And elections were coming up for council, and Holbrook at that time had 9 councillors and only received 6 nominations for the 9 positions, and approaching the local government minister, apparently were granted permission to reduce the numbers to 7. And so they called for a by-election, and I remember trotting into the general manager, who I knew quite well, and said, "What do you reckon? Do you think I could do it?" And of course he said, "Yes, of course you could." So I put my name up for nomination, and I was unopposed, so I got on council without any problem at all, and made up the numbers to number 7, and there I stayed. No intention of taking the top job. I was very happy just being a councillor, and I suppose it got to be about that I can't remember the year, I really can't. But anyway, someone suggested that I should put my hand up for deputy. At that time, Councillor Nigel Ross was chairman. He was actually what we would call president. Yes, not mayors at that stage. And he was president of the Shire Council, and I was his deputy for a year. And then, to my amazement, another lady councillor, Meryl Allworth, said to me, "You've got to put your hand up for mayor because nobody else will do it." Literally. And I was horrified, but I ended up putting my hand up, and that's what happened. And again, unopposed, everyone was happy to have someone else be the bunny and take the job on, I think.
It's funny because anybody who has been involved, whether it's a sporting club or a preschool or whatever it might be, you quite often find the accidental president or the accidental treasurer, where they just simply by showing up, they're given the title and away they go and they learn as they're going along.
Absolutely.
Were you were you the first female mayor or one of the first?
No. I was about the 4th lady councillor, but Meryl Allworth was the first lady Shire president, and I think I was the first mayor. The title changed when I came on board, so I became a mayor. as opposed to a mayoress, which some men used to think I was. But I quickly assured them that if I was the mayoress, I would be married to the mayor.
Yes.
And, right, so you're the mayor. That's the sort
Might
of
have
thing
taken a
that
little while to
happened.
get the minds around that one, perhaps. So let's talk about the Submarine. Let's talk about Holbrook. And you said you weren't real great as a farmer's wife, so to speak. So you've probably been quite proud of perhaps Holbrook and what's happened over the years there, but can we talk about the Submarine story first?
Certainly, as best I can remember it. Chronologically, I may get things wrong because it's a while ago now, but Holbrook, of course, is named after a submariner, Commander Holbrook. He was Lieutenant Norman Holbrook when we first heard of him, but Holbrook acquired his name and over the course of time, someone suggested, it was when country towns were all looking for a theme, you're in the best town, the gateway to somewhere or to whatever, and Holbrook didn't really have a theme, and someone suggested in council that we should lean more on the submarine idea because we're named after a submariner, and so inquiries began regarding what we could do about it. Yes, I think it was, I can't remember who, and it's probably best not to name names in case I get it wrong. But it was suggested that we could form an association with the Australian Submarine Squadron, and connections were made, talks were had, and we ended up granting freedom of entry to the Australian submariners on a couple of occasions where there was great ceremony over a weekend. They played sport with us, they had marching down the street and the formal reading of the Holt Who Goes There stuff by the Shire clerk, and them asking for permission to come into the town and being granted it and all that sort of stuff. I do remember one of those freedom of entries particularly, and I was on council at the time, and we had a big naval helicopter flew up the length of the main street quite low with a huge ensign flying underneath it. It was a real lump in the throat, intensely patriotic moment, and I remember nearly crying with patriotism. It was just so grand, and I kept thinking, this is happening in Holbrook, wow. It was just fabulous. And we had the Navy band and all that stuff. It was quite grand. But anyway, that, of course, formed very strong associations with submariners all over the show, all over the country, really. And then, by chance, we heard that the O-class submarines were being decommissioned, all of them. There were 5, I think. And somebody loosely suggested, why don't we go for a piece of it to have in our park? It was something. And yes, again, formal approaches. We ended up being donated by the Navy. The fin, that's the main, people call it a conning tower, but I believe it is actually a fin. And they agreed to give that to us when at such time as Otway was decommissioned. At some stage, we suddenly were notified that Otway was indeed going to be broken up, and if we wanted the fin, we had to come and get it. It was kind of, panic stations, and through a lot of volunteer work, Rotarians and transport company, funnily enough called Deeps, which we thought was terribly appropriate, went down to Sydney, up to Sydney rather, and Garden Island, and through one way or another acquired this fin which travelled down the highway. My husband was part of the escort team that brought it, and he said it was just amazing how many people were guessing on the radio what on earth it was on the back of this truck lying sideways, because it took up the whole highway and they used to have to get off to let traffic past every so often.
It's interesting because you've highlighted their patriotism, you've highlighted their community spirit and effort, and I guess that belonging and ownership as well of a unique situation like a town name and what the history of some of that is. Do you think if you were trying to do that sort of thing today, that would happen?
It probably would, but we'd get much more involved in OH&S and stuff like that. I mean, these guys were just Rotarians, farmers, engineers, whatever you name, jumped in their utes and what have you, and shot up to Sydney and wandered all over the sub, finding out how they could get stuff off and get it away. There's a bit more to that too. When it was actually put out to tender to scrap the whole thing, we raked up the money through the generosity of a local businessman and managed to find the money for the tender. And at that stage, I didn't even know you had to pay to put in a tender, but it was $10,000. He put the money up. We didn't get the tender, but Sims Metal did. And in the meantime, one of our committeemen had been in touch with Sims, and they agreed that we could come and take what they didn't want. And what we needed was the superstructure above waterline, which is not steel, it's fiberglass. Which a lot of people find hard to believe in a submarine, but that's what it is. And they agreed to let us have that, but the same thing happened. All of a sudden it was, right, we want the rest of it. If you want this, you've got to come and get it. And so there were panic stations as they organised for transport and what have you to bring all these pieces down. It looked like an inverted swimming pool when it came down. It was cut into sections and all carefully numbered. It sat in our park for a while, and a lot of people thought it would sit there forever and just be a harbour for snakes and vermin and such. But out of the blue, a phone call from my treasurer at that time of the Submarine Working Party said, "Are you sitting down, Joan?" I said, "OK, what's happened?" And he said, "I'm holding in my hand a cheque for £50,000 sterling from Mrs. Holbrook." And that equated to approximately a bit over $100,000. To help us get more of the submarine from Sydney. Wow, what a gift, what a gift. It was just, yes, gobsmackingly exciting, terribly exciting. And we were able to go ahead with the whole plan then because we had money. We'd already started trying to raise money and we had probably about $10,000 in our bank account, but we were going to need a lot more to put this thing up. And this just enabled us to go ahead. It was just fantastic. And so it did, and a lot of departments were responsible for it. I know Skillshare was operating at that stage, and a new work opportunity scheme with the current Commonwealth Labor government enabled us to employ about 10 unemployed young men to help the engineers, etc., put the fiberglass pieces together again in the spot we'd chosen for it on the highway. So it all got built, done, and we finally picked a date, a long weekend in June 1997, to have an opening dedication ceremony, and it was going to be as grand as we could possibly make it in Holbrook. And it was. It was fabulous. They had a fantastic crowd, thousands literally, came for the day. The Navy band. We had a ceremonial sunset that night, which is a very rare treat apparently for civilians, if you like. It's a special time, and it was very moving. Yes, a whole weekend of activities anyway. And I haven't got the list with me, but there's commanders and rear admirals and goodness knows what were present at the time. And our very, very special guest was Mrs. Gundula Holbrook, and she came over with very dear friends, the Matthews, who also turned up with a cheque for what was it, 10,000 sterling, which amounted to $20,000 to add to that little lot. So we were just very, very, very fortunate that that money came into our being at that time. Otherwise, we might still be trying to build a submarine out there.
It is such an amazing story because often when you meet people that aren't from around our region, they often say, "Is that submarine still inland? Is that still up the road?" So it's really put Holbrook on the map, and even with the freeway diversion and what have you, the bypass around the township, it's definitely still there. So you sound like you've always been a pretty busy person in the community.
Yeah, I think I've never liked just being on a committee. I always wanted to have more of my husband say I've got a controlling problem, but I do like to be really involved if I'm going to be, not just on the sidelines. And as I said, I've always seemed to have ended up with the role of a secretary or a president or something. But in this instance, I think I was a different sort of a mayor. I really concentrated on the tourism side of things because I felt that, and people knowing where Holbrook is, literally, I mean, we all had the brochure and various other towns have picked it up, where the hell is Holbrook? And I know in my speech on the commemoration day for the submarine, I said now people do know where the hell Holbrook is. And that was absolutely right. I believed in going to things, being present, being there and wearing the Holbrook badge, and any opportunity I had to speak about anything, I did. And I think it was just general promotion of the town and letting people know we're here. We're not disappearing into the Netherland.
Yeah. So when you aren't being busy and generous of your time and all the rest, what do you do with your spare time? What are some of the hobbies that you get up to?
I play golf now. I used to play tennis, but the shoulders gave out there, and for some reason or other a golf swing is quite different to a tennis swing, and I can manage golf very nicely, thank you. So now in my later years I am playing as much golf as I can. I garden. I play piano and organ, and I'm involved in church activities with the Uniting Church, actually in Wodonga. And I think that's about it. Op shop, stuff like that, volunteer work. I did when I came to Albury to live. We retired to Albury, and I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to be the same person I was when I left Holbrook, which was staying in Holbrook meant I was looking at doing the same thing for the next whatever years I had left, and that didn't appeal to me particularly, so we agreed to move. And funnily enough, my husband, who always thought he'd be carried off the farm in a box, was quite happy to come to Taguna, and he fortunately is able to continue an involvement with the farm. It's not very far away, and he probably goes out there 2 or 3 times a week, so that's all very good. It's been a very satisfactory move to Albury, and I took up radio with Vision Australia Radio, reading the Border Mail, until I found early mornings were just a bit much. The eye-opener, getting up at 5 o'clock to be in at the studio by 5:30. So I feel for the early morning risers.
Those that do it time and time
They
again,
do indeed.
day after day. You've had leadership roles, obviously, in the community, and it sounds like you grab a hold of opportunities and really make the most of them. What sort of admiration have you found sort of during your life? Is there anyone that you sort of look up to and think, geez, if I could just be a bit like them?
I think there's no one in particular. I think I've led a very charmed sort of life, I think, and also an easy life. Look, only last night I attended a function where we heard from refugees, and their lives are just so difficult, have been so difficult. I've led such a tiny life compared to them, and I just feel terribly, terribly privileged that I've been able to live the kind of life I would like to live. I don't have any one person that I would say I admire. I admire lots, and particularly these people that have done it really hard but still come through. I think that's fantastic.
You're talking about perspective there, aren't you? Like, in terms
Probably.
of... it sounds like you're thankful and grateful for everything that you've had and all the opportunities you've had in life.
Absolutely, absolutely, because I can't really think of bad things. Yes, there's the odd bad thing. My parents died quite young, and I remember thinking that they'd had a good life. Oh, jingies, they were 65. But the closer I got to 60, the younger it was, and the more I realised how much of life they missed by dying so early. And but I'm very grateful. So yes, that's about.
Have you got any quotes that you live by? Any mantras in life?
Funnily enough, I do have a couple which I latched onto as I became mayor, because that was really stepping outside the box, and one of them is about stepping outside the box. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was accredited with both these sayings, but one of them says, "Unless you step outside that which you already know, you will never grow." And certainly taking on the role of mayor was something I had no idea what was going to happen or what I'd do. And the other one was, "No one can make me feel inferior without my permission."
I love it.
So, because I think I did have a bit of an inferiority complex in my younger days. I always thought everyone was prettier than me, and that I was always grateful for anyone who was a friend of mine, because I thought, oh, gee, she's so lovely and she's my friend, So I grew up a lot, I think.
That's probably a good one for the current, like the latest generation, wouldn't you think? Like, if we get wrapped up in that changing and connected and digital world and all the rest, it's probably a really good message, that one.
Yeah, probably.
So, Joan, I often ask people, what's been their biggest achievement in life, and often when somebody's a parent, they always revert to the family sort of achievement. Well, I'm sure that'll be the same with yourself, but other sort of achievements as well.
Yes, mainly that Submarine, I think. I'd have to say that has to be, as far as an achievement goes. But again, it's not just me. There were just so many people involved in that. I talked earlier a bit about my role as mayor being a different one. I was still a bit of a hands-on person. I recall a particular incident getting ready for this June long weekend when the Submarine was going to be dedicated. The patch there, it had followed a pretty dry period, and the patch where we were putting it was barren. And the Rotary Club, someone had come in with their little scarifier behind a tractor and scarified it up, and there was myself and Robin Scobie and Roger Geddes and Marg Geddes, 4 of us, I think, with ice cream buckets with mixed grass seed in it, walked across that paddock scattering ryegrass and a lawn mixture and then getting the watering going and all that sort of stuff. I preferred to be doing that sort of thing rather than sitting on the sidelines telling other people to go and do it. So I think I was a bit more handsy on, and that was part of the upbringing through committees and such like, that you just did that sort of thing.
Somebody's got to do the lifting.
Yeah, somebody has to do it.
What did you plan to be as a kid? Like, did you... What was it? Because it's always interesting when you talk to people. Like, for me, I was always like, oh, I'll be a fireman or a policeman, or then I turned into wanting to do a trade, and I've never ended up anywhere near what I thought I was going to do. What about yourself?
I don't think I ever had a serious thought about it at all until I probably got to, at some stage, maybe Form 2 or 3 or in school. We did what they called in those days a vocational guidance test, and you answered a lot of funny questions and at the end said what you would like to do. And I remember I listed air hostess, nursing and teaching, and all I got back with my guidance was, yes, you are suited to airline hostessing, guiding or teaching, or what were the middle one? Anyway, nursing and teaching. So I didn't really get much help from that at all. So I guess I always thought I'd be a nurse, and I was.
Yep.
I didn't really think beyond that. In fact, I think I wasn't very adventurous at all, because living in Albury, I loved my life in Albury as a teenager. I just loved what I did and what I was involved in. We had a very large youth group. Each church actually had a very large youth group at that stage. There were over 100 young people in the PFA at that time. And there was a junior PFA and a senior PFA, and I couldn't wait to get into the seniors where I could go to the dances. But, involvement, that's good.
Thinking ahead, what's the future look like other than golf courses?
It's looking very like golf courses. Gardening, we've decided we're going to stay where we are for as long as we can. We like where we live. So no retirement village for us. No, it's really very, very plain and ordinary, just retirement. Our grandchildren are growing up fast. They're all, most of them are adults. There's only a couple still at school. And they're all in good jobs. They live away, so yes, travel to catch up with them occasionally. Holidays, not lots. We don't go away a lot. We're very happy to stay in Australia these days. Limited overseas travel in our life. I'm very happy to just be able to drive up and down the various areas of Australia. There's heaps more to see here.
Yeah, and I think almost every Australian will never see everything that Australia has to offer, because it is so vast.
It's a wonderful country, and we're very lucky, and he's hoping it stays that way and we don't have a nuclear bomb blow off in the middle of the...
Well, fingers crossed we don't end down that path, but you just never know what somebody else in the world's up to or planning. And when you... I'm going to get rid of the COVID theme out of these sort of journeys. There's now been a couple of years where we sort of had to stop and pause for a moment. We couldn't get together with people face to face and talk, and then we've sort of spent a bit of time over the last 12 months dwelling on it a bit. But I really want to get rid of the COVID conversation. But I know there's part of that COVID experience which you've had, which was a real life example of just potentially how poorly Australia treated their own residents. Can we touch on your experience? Because you have lost your daughter to cancer, which is extremely sad, and I know a lot of people, unfortunately, would be able to empathise with you. But you had to go through a decision of choosing which state you'd locate yourself in and where your priorities would be based on the state border closures.
More or less that way, yes. What I would have ideally liked to have done would be hop in the car and drive down to Melbourne for 3 or 4 days, turn around, come back up here for 3 or 4 days, and then go back down, and so on over the period of time that Deb was so very ill. She did have a husband, of course, and a family who were caring for her there too, but she wanted a mum. So I was down there as often as I could, but then the border closures happened, and the nightmare of applying for an exemption was just ridiculous, just ridiculous. I can't explain even now the stupidity of the questions that were asked and the way there was no elasticity, no flexibility allowed in it. This is what it says on the book and we can't tick that box, therefore you can't go. It was just stupid. So I ended up down in Melbourne for about 6 weeks straight and looking after or helping to look after Deb. And I came home, finally got a window of opportunity to come back home just for 3 or 4 days, and when I went back she only had another couple of days to go. So it was, it just was quite ridiculous that these things happened. But we were still only the tip of the iceberg. Ours was there were much worse people, much worse off than we were. And so even under such dire circumstances, we could still see that we ended up being reasonably fortunate because there was a small window of opportunity after she'd passed away for us to have a reasonable funeral in Melbourne and able to invite 80 people. So that was really good, but literally closed soon after that again too, and funerals were down to half a dozen of the main mourners, and that would have just been awful. I can't imagine what it must have been like for people to have to say goodbye with knowing that there would have been a grand farewell, and here it was just so. It was a very let down time.
Scaled right back. Yeah. So think about obviously your experience in local government. Think about how you spoke earlier about the lack of OH&S and things like that when you're relocating parts of Submarine down the freeway, and it was just common practice to pull over and let people pass. I'm sure you probably almost didn't have road permits and things like that. But
they did, but yeah.
from what you've experienced to sort of how the world operates now, and you touched there on the stupidity of the questions they'd ask. And what's your observation or your comments on how we govern our country at the moment, state by state and federally?
Well, for a start, I'm a believer in getting rid of state governments. I just think we're far, far too governed. It bothers me terribly that we keep making rules, pulling rules out of the hat, because the more rules you have, the more room there is to say, well, it's not written down, therefore I can do it. And I think that's a big mistake. We just totally and utterly overgoverned. Too many rules. Not enough personal responsibility for what you're actually doing or enacting. Even our courts seem to do that with people. It's such a common excuse nowadays. He had an abusive childhood. She were treated badly, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. And they're just excuses. And it's, I just sort of believe, oh look, sayings are great. They're warm and fuzzy and lovely, but they're no good unless you actually put them into action, unless you take them on board and say, I'm going to do that. And I'm guilty of it myself, like my favourite sayings, it doesn't always wash unless you put something into action. But I think we all have a choice when we wake up in the morning to be happy or sad. We have a choice when we tackle on anything that we'll either do it or we won't do it. We make choices every instant of every day. And it's just a case of making the right choices. We won't always make the right choices, but then you have to pick up, put it behind you and get on. I think Nelson Mandela said it really well, and he's another person that I admire when I come to think of it, because of the extraordinary circumstances in which he lived for so many years, and yet he could come out of there and forgive. And he said, unless we learn to forgive properly, we're never going to have peace anywhere, because people still, they say they forgive, but then they hold on to the grudge, they hold on to whatever it is, and they can still bring it up later, years later. They haven't really forgiven. And Mandela said you need to really forgive, which means putting it behind you and then getting on with what you can do.
I've got a bit of a saying, it's a moment in time. Because it is. If anything that goes not your way, or anything that goes wrong or something, it is legitimately just a moment in time out of all the other moments of your life. And then if you add up all the moments of everybody else's, not just locally to you but around the world, it's a moment in time.
Yeah, it is indeed.
What can you do about it? You can't change it. Yeah. You can't reverse it. So we'll move on to something that's a bit of fun. The oldie but a goodie. You've got a few people at a dinner table. You can choose alive or people that are no longer with us. You can choose. Some people go rock stars. Some people just bring their family back to the table. Who would you have sitting at a dinner table with you if you had three others?
Well, I did think about this a little bit, and I came up with, funnily enough, my parents. As I said before, they both died at 65, 5 years apart. And I was only in my late 20s, early 30s, and busy with a family. I wasn't interested in what they did in their younger days or how they lived or what their lives were like, and I would love to sit down with them and have a yarn about that now. And funnily enough, I've just had a family reunion where we celebrated 100 years since my grandfather picked his family up from India and brought them to Australia. He was a missionary in India on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. And he took his new wife there, where they proceeded to produce 6, 7 children, I think. Poor wife, I used to say, what a marvellous woman she was that she followed her husband over there. But I would have my parents to dinner and be able to talk about those sort of things. I think Dad was 14 when he came to Australia. I used to love writing that in censuses, that he was born in India. People used to say to me, oh, was he an Indian?
Yeah.
But he wasn't, of course. They were very British. And look, I tried to think of a third one, and I couldn't really go beyond Nelson Mandela. I just really, people like that have been through so much and still come out the other side. I just admire enormously.
Some people in the past have chosen a chef to make sure. Are you a good cook?
Right.
Would you be cooking? Would you be cooking for your guests, or what would you do?
I probably would be cooking for my guests. I'm not a bad cook, but I must say I've deteriorated a bit in old age. I get a bit slack with things now.
The easy options. When you're dining with those people, sweet or savoury, what's your choice?
I'm probably 50-50 because I really like my sweets, but I also like savoury stuff. But I'd lean towards savoury if I had to, because it's healthier probably.
And I think if I ask you, Joan, what's your plans for the weekend, I'm pretty certain you'll probably say if the weather's good enough, you'll be playing golf.
I will be. I'm just recovering from hip surgery, and this is my first day out today, so looking forward to it enormously.
Joan Parker, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as part of the journey, and particularly explaining a little bit more about the Holbrook Submarine experience. And I know you've concisely told a story which is much bigger, and people can go and read about that on some of the signage and plaques and things like that in the township of Holbrook. But you're obviously one of the many that were instrumental in that. And thanks so much for being part of the journey.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's been a pleasure, and I hope it's of some interest.